Welcome everyone who is joining our first Badger Crop Connect program. I'm gonna wait just another minute. A few more people are joining, then we'll get started with the introduction.
Hey, Josh, how do you want to handle questions? Do you want, after each person's presentation, do you want to just have a few minutes in Q&A?
That will be more than fine, Steve. If depending on what you're comfortable with, if you see something in the chat while you're speaking, you can definitely grab that and answer it. But yeah, we will give an opportunity afterwards if someone does want to verbally ask a question.
Great.
You bet. Okay, we have hit 12:30. Hello, welcome to our first Badger Crop Connect webinar of 2023 season. We're excited to be back with this program, and thank you for your attendance today. I am your host, Josh Camps, Regional Crops Educator in Jefferson, Rock, and Walworth counties. Thank you for taking the time to join us from wherever you are in the state on this beautiful day. Sign up for Wisconsin Ag Climate Outlook emails. Just a little bit of a note here. Which are curated weather reports designed with Wisconsin farmers in mind. You can participate in a soybean and soil health study by visiting the link on the screen and submitting some 6-inch soil samples. The UW Crop Enterprise Budget Tool is also available to help you make decisions around spring planting and nutrient application. Finally, you can sign up for text alerts to get a heads up when insect pests emerge around your farm. So those are just a few news and update items. If you want to grab those quick, they're there. We can definitely make those available through through correspondence after the program as well. All right, the Badger Crop Connect series aims to provide timely crop updates for producers and agriculture professionals in Wisconsin throughout the growing season, and is jointly sponsored by the UW-Madison Division of Extension, Crops and Soils, and the Nutrient Pest Management programs. As a federal funding recipient, Extension is required to collect information about its outreach efforts. All information collected when you registered is anonymous and cannot be tracked back to you. Thank you for your assistance, and we will start the webinar in a minute or two. So while many of you are familiar with our virtual presentations and the Zoom platform, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items. If you would, please keep your microphones muted and videos off during the webinar. The mute and video controls are on the bottom left side of your screen. Also, please feel free to type questions for our presenters into the chat box at any time. The chat box is in the bottom center of your screen. We will answer as many questions as we can as time allows. And then also, if you're having difficulties or questions with the Zoom technology, you can type your question into the chat, or alternatively email Chris Bandura. His email will be posted in the chat. And if you are having difficulties with your audio, the call-in information will also be provided in the chat. All right. So first, I'd like to invite Steve Vavrus, our Wisconsin State Climatologist, Assistant Director of the UW-Madison Center for Climatic Research, who will summarize our weather during the past 12 months, report on current soil moisture and hydraulic conditions affecting the growing season, and share some seasonal outlooks for the upcoming spring and summer. Thank you, Steve, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Josh. I'm happy to kick off the Badger Crop Connect series for 2024, and I'll start sharing my screen here. All right, so assuming you can all hear that and see that.
It looks good and sounds good.
Great. Okay. So Steve Vavrus, Director of the State Climatology Office, and this is a gorgeous day. I'm sure it's making a lot of people itching to get out in the fields, and that kind of sets the stage for talking about weather and soil conditions in the coming months. So the talk is going to be structured around these three questions. Looking back, where have we been? Where are we now? And then where are we headed in the coming weeks to months as we look into the spring planting season? Where we've been, we have been warm. It's almost been continuous. If we look back to the beginning of 2023, this is showing the temperature anomalies relative to the most recent normal period, 1990 to 2020. And this is the statewide average anomaly from January through December of last year. The red bars, warmer than usual. Some of these months were exceptional. January last year, the fifth warmest on record. End of the year, December, the very warmest December. September, the sixth warmest. The only month that bucked the trend was July, and he was only slightly below normal, 0.7 of a degree. So basically, all of 2023 ended up being really, really warm, and the fourth warmest year in Wisconsin on record. Now, where have we been since then? When we flip the calendar to 2024, it's probably no surprise to hear that the warmth has continued. We ended up with our warmest winter on record by a full 2 degrees in the state. And if we look back at each month, January was the 10th warmest on record. February recorded the warmest, and then March, quietly the 12th warmest. And what I'm showing here are the departures from normal temperatures since January 1st of this year. And it really pretty much mirrors what happened all winter. Central and northern Wisconsin were exceptionally mild, very little snowpack, very uncharacteristic. Southern Wisconsin also warm, about 4 to 6 degrees warmer than normal. But these anomalies here in red are 6 to 8 Fahrenheit warmer than normal, and some places even a little bit warmer still. So the warmth has continued for sure as we've transitioned into 2024. Now, it's a very different picture when it comes to precipitation. It's not like we've been constant warm, cold, wet, dry. We've been all over the place in terms of precipitation. Going back to January of last year, we had the wettest winter on record in Wisconsin. And then we continued that with the wettest start to a year on record. January through April being the wettest 4 months to start the year, especially last February, you saw more than doubled normal precipitation. And then the weather patterns completely flipped. And into May and June, not only did we not get much rainfall at all, but the air was so dry, extremely low humidities. For around here, we had dry easterly flow coming out of Canada. Eventually, of course, we had the wildfire smoke in June, and it was just a bizarre switch to our weather pattern. That ended up resulting in the fourth driest May through August on record. And here you see May and June, less than half of normal rainfall. Things got a lot better in October, as I'll show in a moment. We had over 50% of normal precipitation, but then we flipped right back to dry in November, 8th driest November on record, and then closed the year a little bit wetter than normal in December. So if you're keeping score, we ended up having 6 wet months and 6 dry months. So the annual totals were not that far from normal, but in actual fact, it was anything but normal. And here's how we've continued into 2024 when it comes to precipitation. January was actually really close to normal, just a 2% anomaly, but February was really dry, about 60% below normal. And then March, we rebounded again back to 36% above statewide. And that temporal variability that we see from month to month and have seen is mirrored in the spatial variability. So here's the percent of normal precipitation since the start of 2024. And you see really big differences depending on where you live in the state. If you're in the south, southeast, there's been plenty of precipitation. These areas in blue, more than 120% or 20% above normal. And then the purple, even bigger still, upwards of 50% of normal. And the green is still somewhat wetter than average, but as you get farther and farther west and north into Wisconsin, all of these yellows are below normal precipitation. The oranges, 80 to 90% of normal. Then when you get into the dark oranges and reds, it gets to be a pretty big shortfall. So the precipitation pattern, it depends what time of month or time of year, which month you're talking about, and then also what part of the state you're talking about. Now, part of that precipitation shortfall in the north is reflected in the snow drought in our state. That we had statewide, we had a shortage of snow this year, but what was strange was that the South generally got more than the North. We had a couple big snowstorms in January that clipped the South, some of the eastern Wisconsin, but in the Northwest, where we expect to see a lot of snowfall, it was not coming for the most part. And so we see this odd pattern of accumulated snowfall for the season, not only a less than usual, but also this oddity that there was more generally in the South. But where you really can tell how strange it was for snow this year is the departure from the average on the right. Areas in yellow, the light yellow is anywhere from a 20-inch shortfall of seasonal snowfall. But the farther north you go, the more pronounced these anomalies are. And by the time you get to northwest Wisconsin, north central Wisconsin, I'm talking 20 to 40-inch shortfalls, and farther north still in the Lake Superior snowbelt, that snow making machine was pretty much out of commission this winter simply because we didn't have enough cold polar air masses. We certainly had enough open lake water, but not enough cold polar air to generate the lake effect snow. So pretty much the farther north you go in Wisconsin, the bigger your snowfall shortfall was, which not only had big implications for the tourism industry, but for ag as well, because we had a double whammy that snowmelt didn't infiltrate into the soils because it wasn't there for the most part. And then the lack of snow cover meant that we had enhanced evaporation during the winter, which is usually pretty minimal, but over time, this year being such a strange one with so much bare ground, that actually could have been important. So that was the snow drought, but we're still dealing with the overall drought carrying over from last year. This is the most recent U.S. Drought Monitor map from last Thursday, and it shows that there's still considerable dryness in the state. The yellow areas are places that are rated abnormally dry, D0, and then the lighter colored areas are moderate drought, D1, and then you see some areas more orange colored that are still in severe drought. And so we see two main areas. The first pronounced area of dryness is in the far north and far northeast. And then the other area that I think is more concerning is in the southwest, where you still have a fair amount of severe drought stretching along the Wisconsin River and north. Now, I do think this is going to improve somewhat in the map that comes out tomorrow, especially here in the east and northeast. But for now, this is the current drought situation. And so it shows that Wisconsin remains dry. But just to put it in perspective, this is where we were last September. Just to show you the improvement. This is the peak of the drought in the middle of last September. It just amazing. All this red. It looks like the state has a case of hives. All these splotches in different parts of Wisconsin. You could hardly escape it unless you were in far eastern Wisconsin. And again, the southwest part of the state was hit the hardest. Large areas of extreme drought, and then most remarkable of all, the farther southwest you got, areas of exceptional drought, D4, the darkest red color. Last year was the first time any part of Wisconsin had ever made it into the highest drought category. That happened earlier in the summer up in Douglas and Bayfield counties, and then more persistently later in the summer in the Southwest. And that's the reason why the Southwest is still suffering the hangover from last year's extreme dryness. And if we take a look why, even though we have had some beneficial rains lately, we've got a lot of precipitation deficit to make up. This is showing the departure from normal precipitation over the last 365 days. So going back to this time last April, and the red colors indicate a shortfall of a foot or more. That is an awful lot over the course of a year, and it's even worse into Iowa. But this tongue of extreme dryness is stretching into Wisconsin as well. And even some of these areas in orange are still substantial, an 8 to 12-inch deficit to make up. So this is the time of year we start to get more precipitation into the spring and summer, but we've got a long way to go, and it'll probably take a while before we make up a deficit this big. One way we can sort of describe or characterize the drought conditions, in the state is by looking at what I call the Drought Severity Coverage Index. So this is a combination of the severity of a drought in any location and the extent of drought around the state. So it's basically the spatially weighted statewide average of drought conditions. And we score this based on the U.S. Drought Monitor. So if you're in white, so conditions are good, you get a score of 0, abnormally dry a 1, moderate drought a 2, and so on up to exceptional drought. So if you just give a number to all of these drought categories and add up their area, you end up currently with a drought score, a DSCI of 1.24, which tells us that on average, Wisconsin's landing somewhere between abnormally dry and moderate drought. And to put that into perspective, we can see where we've been compared with the last 15 months or where we are today. So if we turn back the clock and look at all of the Drought Severity Coverage Index values for Wisconsin from the Drought Monitor going back to the very beginning of January last year, we see that at this time a year ago, there was no drought concern whatsoever. We were flatlined at 0, meaning that everybody had good soil moisture. And that's the way it was all the way through April into May. But then things quickly changed, as we all remember, and we had an intense flash drought, and we just went up week after week after week in Wisconsin, getting worse and worse drought, more and more extensive too. And anytime you get above 2, that means that the statewide average is moderate drought. And we were in that condition for most of the summer. And then things got even worse in late summer as we had a late season heat wave, and the continued dryness kept adding up until we hit those peak conditions in late September. And then fortunately, we had some beneficial rains September and then into October. By Thanksgiving, we landed here just about where we are today, basically consistent throughout most of the winter. And then that dry February boosted us by late February, early March, some concerns where we're going to keep going up. And fortunately, the last couple of weeks, we've had some nice rains to bring us back down. And I think we'll have a little bit more improvement still this week. So we're still pretty high, but we're a lot better than we were for much of 2023. So currently where we are, according to the NASS, the USDA Agricultural Statistics report that just came out this week, this is showing the topsoil moisture deficit by crop or climate division. And it's showing the percent of the area that has topsoil moisture rated short to very short. And depends where you are. Eastern Wisconsin's in pretty good shape, especially the southeast. There's no concerns, but it's still dry in the west central part of the state and the central part, so around 30% considered a deficit. But the real story is the subsoil. We're still not making up for the dryness from last year. And if you look at the subsoil moisture deficit, short to very short, you see in every division, it's considerably greater deficit in the subsoil, and 33% in the Northwest to 49%, 31 to 51 in West Central, and so forth. So these are pretty big shortfalls, 50% in West Central and the Northwest. And so it will take probably some time before we make up for that big of a loss. Now, as I said, we've had some beneficial rains of late, especially in the south and southeast. This is showing the departure from normal precipitation over the past 14 days. The purple area is getting the very most way down here in Rock County, where I happen to live, and over toward Milwaukee and Northeast. Pretty good amounts here. This is 1.5 inches in blue or more above normal. But you see, not everybody has benefited. The areas here in the Southwest, which need it the most, have been near normal, and other parts of the state only slightly greater than normal. Now, there is potentially a change in terms of more widespread rainfall statewide over the next 7 days. This is the latest National Weather Service forecast for precipitation over the next week. The purple area is showing a substantial amount of rainfall, 1.5 inches or more, and really everybody in the state getting more than an inch according to this forecast. But I would take it with a grain of salt in the sense that most of this appears to be later in the forecast period, more in the 4 to 7 day period. And of course, the longer you go out, the more dicey the forecasts become. But at least if we are looking to make up some of this moisture deficit in our soils, this would be considered good news. The other issue, of course, is the soil temperatures, and they vary across the state. Right now, we have limited data in northern Wisconsin, but for the most part, soils, this is at 4-inch depth, are in the low to mid 40s, some places even in the upper 40s. It's hard to find long-term records of soil moisture or soil temperatures to know exactly how this compares with normal, but it stands to reason that these are higher than usual because of our early start this winter and then the mildness we had in March. Okay, so that's where we've been and where we are, and now where are we headed? The latest temperature outlooks from NOAA for the next week to 2 weeks are shown here. So this is covering next Wednesday through the following Wednesday. And these outlooks are always expressed in probabilities rather than an absolute temperature forecast. We don't see a great signal for Wisconsin. We see kind of near normal chances in the gray for warm or cold or near normal. And then the rest of the state leaning toward warmer. That's quite different than the stronger signal in the southeast or the northwest. So, you know, if you had to bet, you would probably say a slight one toward warmer in the next week to 2 weeks. And in terms of precipitation, there are also hints that will be wetter than normal, not only in the next 7 days, but in the next week to 2 weeks. Not a huge signal, but indications are that that's probably the direction we're headed. And notice that Wisconsin's right in the middle of this broad area, suggestive of wetter than normal conditions. Now, when we look out for the entire spring, as we think about planting conditions and growing conditions, this is the forecast that NOAA made as of late March for the upcoming spring. So this covers the months of April, May, and June. Again, expressed as probabilities, this is a pretty bullish signal of a warm spring. So this area in orange, which encompasses all of Wisconsin, if you look down here at the legend, that represents a 50 to 60% probability of warmer than normal conditions. So we can say it's likely, according to this forecast, that all of Wisconsin will have a warm spring. That would just continue with the momentum we've had of warm months since the beginning of last year. And then the final graphic here is the precipitation outlook for spring. Again, April, May, June. Here, unfortunately, we don't have much to go on. Equal chances throughout Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. There's just not really a clear meteorological signal indicating whether we'll see a wet spring, a dry spring, or near normal. I guess the good news is that there's no sign that we'll have a drought in the next few months, but equally valid, there's no indication that will be unusually wet or even near normal. So that's what we have to go on, such as it is. And to wrap up here, these are my main takeaways. First, it has been a wild meteorological ride the past 15 months. You know, record heat, weird back and forth precipitation, the wildfire smoke last summer, February tornadoes, you name it. We've had it. But one thing that's been fairly consistent is the unseasonable warmth, month to month. We've had some temporary cold snaps, but they've been few and far between. Only 1 month slightly below normal since the beginning of last year, and the NOAA forecast for the spring is for continued unseasonable warmth. As I mentioned, we've had extreme precipitation variability, especially last year, but continuing into February and March of this year. Had a record warm winter with that snow drought, especially in northern and northwest Wisconsin. It's important to remember that the drought is continuing to persist in Wisconsin, especially in the southwest, where it was hit the hardest by the drought last summer. Drier subsoils than topsoils in most places. It's easy to kind of forget when we get a good rain to think, oh, the soils are moist enough now. But if you dig down very far, you may be surprised at still how long it takes for these subsoils to respond. There are some hopeful signs for near-term rains in the next week or two, according to the Weather Service, and fairly likely conditions for an abnormally warm spring, April through June, according to the projections. But unfortunately, we don't have much to go on for spring rainfall. So kind of a flip of the coin in terms of how wet our upcoming spring will be. So I will stop sharing here, and if there's any time for questions, Josh, you're running the show, so let me know how you want to handle that, and we'll see if there's any questions that come through in chat that we can respond to as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Steve. We appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today. There aren't any questions that came in just yet. I'll let you monitor the chat as you have time. And I think we're going to just keep moving along with our next speaker today. So